What's going on, guys? It's your man with the plan, Samuel Plan, coming back at you once again with another brand new installment of Sports Entertainment is Dead right here on Lords of Pain Radio. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you missed last week's episode, you can still go catch that on demand. The way to do it is very simple. Head over to Spreaker, head over to lordsofpain.net, and you can catch my last episode of SEID on demand. You can also do it through your usual podcast provider as well. Please also make sure you check out all the other great shows here on Lords of Pain Radio. We have stuff coming to you each and every single day of the week, covering everything from New Japan Pro Wrestling, Ring of Honor, TNA, indie circuits, British wrestling, you name it, we've got coverage for it, so do make sure you check out all the wonderful shows. You can do so by subscribing. Don't subscribe to Lords of Pain Radio, but do subscribe to each of our shows by their individual name, and that way you can make sure you don't miss a second of the great coverage we've got for you here on Lords of Pain Radio. It is another week in my ongoing project for Sports Entertainment is Dead Year 2. If, of course, you're unfamiliar with it, and this is the first time you're tuning in, I take a guest host every single week, and we explore a match chosen quite at random, historically either by myself or said guest, to explore the themes, the creative merits, the character, the narrative, its historical importance, anything that we think is worth commenting on. It's all inspired by my book, 101 WWE Matches to See Before You Die, which you can still go ahead and buy on Amazon anywhere in the world. And of course, it's also the inspiration behind my second incoming book, which will be a direct sequel to 101, but will be focused specifically on the new generation era. Both of these books explore many of the benefits that come with watching your professional wrestling as performance art rather than as sports entertainment, which, as the title of my show implies, is, in my belief, dead. That's what these match explorations aim to do as well. And this week, we have another. And joining me this week is, well, he's another LOP living legend, if he doesn't mind me saying so. He is, of course, the author of Doctor's Orders on lordsofpain.net. He is the host of the long-running podcast The Doc Says, which preceded SEID in this Wednesday slot on Lords of Pain Radio. And he is the author of not one but two books, the WrestleMania Era, the Book of Sports Entertainment, and, of course, the greatest rivalries and matches of the WrestleMania Era. I hope I got that title right. The book's on my bookshelf some way away, so I can't quite read it. He's well known to anybody who listens to Lords of Pain Radio and to anyone who's read lordsofpain.net over the years, and he's been on the show before. I want to welcome back the Doc himself. It's Chad Matthews. Welcome back to the show, Chad.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent stuff. So you're sort of fully aware of the change that SEID's undergone for its second year, and we are looking at a match from the relatively distant past at this point this week. It was your pick, and it's Jake the Snake Roberts versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat in a snake pit match from Saturday night's main event on the 4th of October 1986. And the thing that I want to talk about from the off here, Doc, is that when I sort of approached you about coming on the show and asked if there were any sort of matches that you in particular would be interested in covering, it was pretty much without hesitation that you suggested this one. I'd be interested at the top of the show, first of all, to hear, and for the listeners to hear, why it was you decided to pick this one out in particular.
Well, I wanted to pick out a match from a far gone era that I felt like people would have a lot of fun listening to us break down. And then, since you are the performance art guy, I think that one of the most characterful times in WWE history was that Hulkamania era, the rock and wrestling era of the 1980s. It may not necessarily appeal to the match rating aficionados, but this type of match between Roberts and Steamboat is an awesome representation of the benefits, I think, of the performance art approach, because you're looking at it through the eyes of these characters, and there are it's very distinct what both guys bring to the table here, which we'll talk about momentarily. But I thought that you would enjoy it a lot if you'd never really broken it down before, and I thought that the listeners would enjoy a good change of pace and maybe find a hidden gem at a time that maybe they hadn't really appreciated that much.
Well, absolutely. I mean, 1986, it's before WrestleMania 3, obviously, which was a few months after this, of course, at the beginning of sort of roughly beginning of 1987, March 1987. The reason I point that out is because I sort of have seen WrestleMania 3 for some time now as the night Vince McMahon sort of committed to what professional wrestling was then going to be for the next 20, 30 years, when Hulk Hogan beats Andre the Giant, who had obviously been, I believe, undefeated for many years prior to that, and Hulk Hogan being something of a wrestling fantasy. So for it to have preceded that, I found very interesting. And what struck me, and as you say, we'll sort of get into the characters and all that sort of good stuff as we go along here. But the thing that I wanted to discuss first of all was the sort of the style of the match, which is, I've spoken on this show before, and I've written before as well about sort of ring fashions and the fashions of how wrestling matches look and watch changing over time. And obviously this is a world away from the kind of wrestling that we see predominantly in the ring today. I've often referred to wrestling from this golden age from the 1980s as being structuralist. It's not so much about what you do as much as it is about the way that what you do is structured. When it's done matters more than what's done. And this was a prime example of that, I felt. And on the surface, because it's a snake pit match, which essentially seems to translate as Jake the Snake Roberts brings Damien out, but Ricky the Dragon Steamboat combats that. He brings out what I would guess is a Komodo dragon. I'm no zoologist, so I don't know, but certainly it's a dragon.
It is indeed. Yeah.
You could be forgiven for saying it's quite an obvious thing to do. It's quite an obvious approach. But I think if you said that, it wouldn't necessarily be an insult or a criticism of the match, because it feels a little bit like the art of the obvious is something that's been lost a little bit in professional wrestling today. You can think of, in particular from this year, you think about the build-up to the women's main event at WrestleMania, for example. It could have been very, very straightforward and very, very simple and very, very basic, but they sort of horribly convoluted it with weeks and weeks of sort of back and forth, just haphazard storytelling. I always reference something like Jericho and Punk at WrestleMania 28 as well, which started out gestated as a best in the world versus best in the world, and again got layered up with demons of addiction and family past with addiction and all this kind of stuff, and I felt like that watered it down. It feels like what you see in this snake pit match isn't something we see very much anymore, which is them taking a very basic sort of almost high concept idea and then just sticking with that and then letting the performers bring it to life through just characterful interaction in the ring.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stands out about that 1980s style is it's not only is it simple, but you can tell that it almost seems like they go out there with that classic sort of mindset of what's all right, what's the finish? Okay, cool. All right, we'll work it out when we get out there. Sure. And just let the crowd dictate some of what we do, and just let the characters sort of rule the day. The action is so simple and basic, but it's in a good way, I think, when you watch something like this, because the characters pop. Jake Roberts is obviously a character that jumps off the screen. His presence is, even at this point, which, for those not familiar, October 1986, when that Saturday night's main event match took place, that's very, very early on in Jake Roberts' WWF career. So, he had debuted, I think he debuted earlier that year, if I'm not mistaken. So this is not somebody who has evolved into the three-dimensional type character that we would eventually come to know, but you could see the potential there from the mannerisms, the body language, and that emphasis on body language and character and the facial expressions. That's really what makes 1980s wrestling, to me, noteworthy. It's not about the moves, it's about the actions and the characters really displaying what they believe themselves to be. It's less homogenized. it's far, far less homogenized than what we see today, when you get the sense that, character is kind of almost thought of as a background piece of the puzzle, or at least is often seemingly presented that way in WWE today.
It seems very frequently like it's left at the door the night of the big pay-per-view match, to me, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that. I mean, there have been some noteworthy examples of character consistency in big matches, like the Rollins and Lesnar match at SummerSlam this year. But beyond that, I mean, this is an example of a company that's putting together a roster of characters, not wrestlers, so to speak, if the distinction makes sense. So I love watching stuff like this, because at a time when I really crave some of the simpler details being paid attention to, going back and watching stuff from the 80s is a callback to simple can sometimes be a really good thing. There's a reason why the KISS formula works. Keep it simple and just let these guys kind of just work their character through the match. And you're not often going to see in a situation like this anything aesthetically all that brilliant in terms of the physical action. But if that's what you focus on here, then you're missing the point.
Absolutely. I mean, my personal opinion would be that if you're ever focusing on that over a character, then you're missing the point of professional wrestling. But that's a deeper conversation we've sort of had once before on this show, almost a year ago, and is perhaps a conversation for another day. Let's talk a little bit about the match then. The first thing that I think it's worth pointing out, and I feel like this is probably something you and I have had little debates about in the past, is that it's not that long a match. Certainly by modern standards, where it seems, and I was pondering this a lot recently as of recording, the fact that, again, to sort of use a modern day comparison, where we're living in an age where pay-per-views are more often than not closer to 4 hours than 3 hours, regardless of whether they're a big four, and a large part because, you get all of these sort of middle of the card matches, which if this was on a modern day pay-per-view, it would probably be. And they last, upwards of 15 minutes most of the time, regardless of whether or not the story is particularly one that has popped the fan base, regardless of whether the match warrants that length of time, but is nonetheless, this seems to be the order of the day, and I think it tends to rob pay-per-views of their pace, and it tends to rob pay-per-views of their atmosphere a lot of the time, because they sort of start to sag in the middle. But I've always felt like matches, just because a match is longer doesn't necessarily mean a match is better, and I feel like this is a prime example of that being brought to bear, because it's in fact, I've written my notes here, while you could call it short in terms of runtime, it doesn't feel short as much as it does swift. It reminded me a lot of the kind of match that Roberts would have years later with Randy Savage at this Tuesday in Texas, in the sense that it's easily digestible, it's friendly to revisiting, the pace is what I would describe as hasty, particularly from Ricky Steamboat early on. He sort of comes out lightning fast, with his usual kind of martial prowess in the ring. But it's really, I think, and I don't mean to lambast Ricky the Dragon, who I'm a big fan of, always have been, but I think it's really Jake who makes this, and I'm curious as to whether you'd agree. It's really, for me, Jake who makes this as wonderful a match as it is to watch, because and you referenced body language earlier, it's the way he's fixated on the Dragon's own bag with the dragon in it, which, to begin with, you aren't, and necessarily it's sort of sold as if you're not sure whether there's a dragon in it or not, or what's in it. And Jake is, you see the script flipped, and where usually Jake's psychological advantage with Damien in the bag would be to his boon, here you see how he reacts when he's presented with the same situation, and he seems obsessed with what is in Ricky the Dragon's bag, and it turns kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? It's very rewarding seeing the villain sort of put through his paces in that way, but only because I think that when Jake has the advantage, it's a deliciously evil performance from him. Jake was a performer and a character who enjoyed being the bad guy so much, and it was always so visible on television that he enjoyed doing that. And I think that's probably what made him putting aside kind of all of the stuff that we could say about him being one of the masters of psychology and whatnot, just the fact that he so obviously relished playing those games with other characters, I think, is what makes this match and almost any Jake Roberts match so wonderful to watch.
On the Ricky Steamboat front,
yes.
For context, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not that familiar with this match and what led up to it, I want to throw that out there real quick, because I think one of the best things about Ricky Steamboat's game was when he had somebody to play off of, his babyface comebacks. I mean, his heroic sort of struggle to try to get to a victory was palpable. You could feel it. But and what started this whole thing was Jake Roberts mentioning earlier, he's just debuted. The DDT is what he psychologically always would build some of his more famous matches around. As a babyface in particular, Jake Roberts would practically in later years, that would be it. I mean, that's the whole premise of a Jake Roberts match, is just to hit his home run shot and try to goad you into being vulnerable to it. But what built the DDT's reputation was he planted Ricky Steamboat's head into the arena floor. And the rumor has always been that it legitimately knocked him out, that it legitimately knocked out Ricky Steamboat. They certainly sold it that way. But there was a lot of talk behind the scenes that that's exactly what actually happened, is the DDT was established as this really deadly finishing move that if you got hit with that, then it was all over. So psychologically, that always played in to Jake Roberts matches. So you have that setting the stage on a previous Saturday night's main event earlier in the year. And at that time, somebody hitting their finisher on you on the floor, no pads on the floor on this particular spot. So basically just the concrete floor. That's the start of a really, I mean, that's the foundation for it. May not seem like all that much now when we see somebody get, thrown off the stage and then thrown out of an ambulance and then thrown back into the ambulance, and then the ambulance gets pushed over, and then a big giant crate's pushed on top of the ambulance, and then it's lit on fire and it explodes, and the guy's back into the next week like nothing ever happened, and a Band-Aid on his forehead. But back then, getting knocked out, and some may be more familiar with another classic Ricky Steamboat injury, the one that he suffered to his throat leading up to WrestleMania 3, as Plan referenced that event earlier as being sort of a foundational event for what we'd know WWF to become. But when Ricky Steamboat was in a mode where he was fighting back from something like that, that always to me was Ricky Steamboat at his WWF best. Ricky Steamboat could do it all. He was someone who could wrestle for an hour and do that better than anybody else, but he could also go into these 8 to 10 minute type situations and do that as well as anybody else. So certainly Jake Roberts is the psychological hook that makes you drawn into the fiction playing out, particularly if you're not familiar with the backstory. But, Ricky Steamboat always has been said that he is the consummate protagonistic character in pro wrestling. He never was able to play a villain because nobody would buy it. He just looked like a good guy, and he was the consummate good guy. So I wanted to throw that out there about Steamboat, because this was one of those situations, in my opinion, where the scenario lent itself to playing to Ricky Steamboat's strengths, which is being opposite a cunning, sadistic villain like Jake Roberts. And it was awesome with Jake because there were so many simple elements to this match. The Komodo dragon in the bag, for those of you that aren't that familiar with Jake Roberts' lore, the whole of one of his psychological ploys in every match was he had Damien in the bag. So you could throw that out there, and that's always something that was designed to be a distraction to his opponent. You get over to the corner in which that bag is laying, and whoa, you got to back away from it because there's a python in it. Or was Damien a python?
I have no idea.
Yeah, let's say
He
for
was a
argument's sake
snake.
that Damien was a python. So, you've got that dangerous element. So to give him a dose of his own medicine by bringing a Komodo dragon in a bag, you've got to watch him go through the psychological paces of, oh crap,
Sure, no, absolutely.
There's this bag. Is there anything in this bag? Maybe there's nothing in that bag and he's just messing with me. There is something in that bag. So this is what it feels like. You can kind of see those sorts of thoughts written on Jake Roberts' face. And that's when we talk about it not being about so much the action, but being about the smaller character details. That is what makes the runtime flow so well and go by. See, it could be, it doesn't feel like it's a short match because there's so much character involved that you just get sucked right in, and whenever it ends, then you get pushed back out. But it's an experience of really enjoying those kinds of details, and nobody in that era, the reason, folks, why people just absolutely put Jake Roberts on the pedestal when it comes to psychology is from matches like this and just watching the body language and the facial expressions.
Committed is I think the word that I would use. Jake was so in character. In my book, 101 WWE matches to see before you die, available to buy on Amazon, folks. I write, one of the matches I write about is Randy Orton versus Shane McMahon at No Way Out 2009. And one of the reasons I write about it is because of Randy Orton's commitment to his character in that match. There's something you got, like, just as the order of the day from Jake Roberts. At whatever point you could lift it, you could pick him at any point in his WWF tenure, pick any match he wrestled, whether he was a villain or a hero, or anti-hero for that matter, and you'd get that incredible commitment to the fictional character that he's playing, which is, like we were saying earlier, I think, again, something of a not even so much a lost art, but I think we sometimes as wrestling fans forget that what we're watching on screen is technically, fictional characters interacting with one another, rather than, it being presented as the actual performer themselves. Wrestling's such a unique beast in that sense that I think it's easy to lose sight of that line, but not when you're watching Jake Roberts particularly, and support everything you said about Ricky Steamboat as well. And I think that collectively what you get with this match is a real exercise in what just the how much a match can live off of implication and subtext, and what has been augmented by a robust story leading into it. And you can sort of talk about what makes the story leading into it so effective, but it's almost irrelevant. The point is that because it's had that effective storytelling ahead of time, when you get to this big payoff match, which feels like a payoff match. In fact, Mean Gene, I think in an interview with Jake Roberts before the match, actively asks, "Is this a rubber match?" Because they're tied up 1-1. It's made twice as effective. Everything means a little bit more because of the story and the affecting story that's been told ahead of time. So you get this atmosphere that, again, I think lacks today. It's sort of a bit like comparing, I'm a big movie fan as well, and you have sort of, body horror films, gory horror films, something like The Fly, for example, which are horrific because of the content of the film and what you're seeing. And then you get psychological horror films that are more about the atmosphere, something like The Shining, which feel uncomfortable and feel disquieting. And I would always compare Jake Roberts, particularly this match, to the sort of the psychological horror film. It's about the atmosphere and it's about the implication. One of the things that we've both written about at lordsofpain.net in the past, and something that I explore quite extensively in my book, is the idea of genre in wrestling. And one of the things that I loved so much about this Snake Pit match is because it's not just Damien in the corner, to pick up on what you were saying, that is causing those kind of reactions from, in this case, Ricky Steamboat, but because you've also got the Komodo Dragon on the other side of the ring as well. it sort of becomes. It reminded me very much of the way that Dean Ambrose sold the Lumberjack match with Seth Rollins ahead of time at SummerSlam 2014 as a human cage, which I think is something that has roots in the distant past as well. And this was I got a similar vibe from this. It felt like, in a strange way, not too dissimilar from a cage match, because it felt like neither one of them could stray too far towards either corner without getting embroiled in something they didn't want to be embroiled in, which was an interesting notation that I wanted to bring up. Do you think, would this match have been heralded more than it is? And this is something that you have written about extensively yourself, Doc. Had it taken place a few months later at WrestleMania 3?
I think so. I think it would have been. That's one of the things that makes this choice one I wanted to make, is that this Saturday Night Main Event franchise in its early phase was really, it was what took the place of what we've now come to expect from monthly pay-per-views. So between Saturday night's Main Event and the core pay-per-view lineup that they would build in the WWF, that was where big feuds paid off. So this was essentially the payoff of the Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Jake Roberts feud. And I don't think that there's really any doubt, if the same match takes place on a big pay-per-view, then by all means, hypothetically, if Survivor Series had started in 1986 instead of 1987, and they would have been positioned opposite each other in one of those types of 5-on-5 traditional elimination matches, and then had this as a reference point to inform it. I think there are a lot of ways they could have put a spotlight on this that would have historically made it more relevant. And it's kind of sad that it's not as relevant as it could be just because of that. But I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think you take the exact same match and splash it onto a WrestleMania 3 card. And, Maverick often talks about how much love he has for the Billy Jack Haynes and Hercules match at WrestleMania 3.
A love I share.
Yeah, and I like it as well. You extract that and put this in its place, then I think it only enhances the reputation of WrestleMania 3 and gives people a little. Well, obviously, you couldn't do that because you'd take away arguably the greatest WWE match of all time that Ricky Steamboat was involved in. But just, for argument's sake, yeah, absolutely.
He could have pulled double duty. It's fine.
He absolutely could have, especially if they're wrestling for 8 minutes.
Well, quite absolutely. And you mentioned earlier as well, just as we sort of round off here, quite early on in Jake Roberts' tenure, how important do you think, because Jake Roberts would become, and it's kind of sad that, his issues with obviously substance abuse have been very well documented over the years, and he's been himself very forthright and open in talking about it. And that's probably a large reason why the company has over the years kind of distanced themselves from celebrating his career too much. But Jake Roberts was easily one of the linchpins of that foremost era in WWE's modern history, and at times rivaled, many people say, Hulk Hogan in popularity, which is, they claim, one reason why the two of them never wrestled. How important do you think, given how early this is in his tenure with the company, this feud and, by sort of implication, this match was in establishing Roberts as a major player in the company, to be pitted against the de facto hero of the day, if you like, the worker hero of the day, and in a situation in which, because, lest we forget, Jake Roberts doesn't really get the last laugh here. I think he loses the match. I watched it about a week ago now, so I can't quite remember, but I don't think he wins it, does he?
He does not win it. He does not. I think that undeniably, this was the feud that set the stage for Jake Roberts to become what he became. And this was the other interesting thing about this is it wasn't long after this that he became so popular that by WrestleMania 3, he is no longer in the villainous role. And it's a long time before he takes on that villainous role again. So what you see in the Ricky the Dragon Steamboat match is not only the launching pad for the great career he would go on to have, his Hall of Fame career, but it's also a big part of the very limited sample size of villainous Jake Roberts that we actually got. Peak villainous Jake Roberts is not someone who has a large library of work that you can choose to review and reflect upon, because he was so good. This is one of those classic examples of one of those guys who was so good at being bad that the crowd very quickly started to gravitate toward him. And there are lots of elements to that. You know, psychologically, this is a guy who in an era of bodybuilders isn't one. Ricky Steamboat looks like a Greek god, some would say. Jake Roberts does not. So there was an everyman quality to him that you could see, that you could just see when you looked at him, and that translated to people gravitating to him as well. But this was the feud that gave him the platform to best showcase his skill set in the ring, the quality of the matches that he was having, the stories that he told with Ricky Steamboat were of a higher level than anything he had done prior to that on the WWF stage. So without the Ricky the Dragon Steamboat match, and this is a testament to Ricky Steamboat, I don't know that you get the same kind of resonance from the fan base that ultimately leads to what becomes of Jake Roberts in 1987, because this is October. By January, he's well on his way to becoming the number, basically the number 3 most popular guy in the company, if not number 2 behind Hogan. So very historical piece of work from these guys when you bring up those elements.
Absolutely, an important match to watch, and I'm sure I haven't looked for them, but I'd be pretty certain and pretty confident that the preceding 2 matches are probably available to see on the network as well. So well worth checking out. Jake the Snake Roberts versus Ricky the Dragon Steamboat in a snake pit match, Saturday night's main event, 4th of October 1986. It's on the network. If you can navigate the horrific update of the network, it's there to see, and highly recommended by myself, of course, by the Doc who picked it. Doc, thank you for joining me this week to explore that match. You'll be back with me next week, of course. And if you wanted to know what match we'll be covering next week, folks, it's another old classic. This one was my pick, and it was actually a match I hadn't seen before I sat down to watch it for the purpose of this show. It was a match I was aware of, I just never watched it, and I thought it'd be quite fitting. Speaking of early 1987, it is Hulk Hogan defending the WWF Championship against Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, with Bobby the Brain Heenan in his corner in a steel cage match on Saturday night's main event from the 3rd of January 1987. So you can be sure to go check that out on the network ahead of next week's show. Thanks again, Doc. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you again for having me. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking about the next match.
Marvelous stuff. And guys, if you have any thoughts just before I head off here about any of the things that Doc and I have discussed this week, or about the match we've discussed this week, or indeed if you want to let me know any thoughts about the match we're going to be discussing next week ahead of time, you could do so through all the usual means. Tweet me at LOPPlan, drop me an email at samuel.plan101@gmail.com, look me up on Facebook, just look for Samuel Plan. You could drop me a comment on lordsofpain.net on any of my podcasts or column posts, or even head over to Spreaker and do it there. Or, of course, best of all, you can sign up to LOP forums. We get loads of comments, great comments each and every single week on articles and columns or podcasts that we post on the site from you guys. And I think many of you, I'm not just saying this, many of you would make for great columnists. Head over there. And hell, even if you don't want to write wrestling columns, you just want to talk to some good folks about some good stuff, LOP forums is the place to do it. So with that being said, my thanks once again to Doc. Look forward to him joining me again next week. Look forward to you doing the same. And until this time next week, stay safe and have a good one.